On May 28, 1940, inside the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring read an intelligence report and reacted with open disdain. The document summarized President Franklin D. Roosevelt's appeal to the U.S. Congress for a massive expansion of American aircraft production, an unprecedented goal of manufacturing 50 planes per year. Göring dismissed the proposal as laughable propaganda. If the Americans believed such claims could intimidate Germany, he scoffed, they revealed only their ignorance of real warfare and industrial reality. He mocked the idea that automobile factories could simply be converted into aircraft plants, insisting that building warplanes required far more than assembly lines and civilian manufacturing habits. What Göring failed to understand was that, at that very moment, in Detroit, a Danish-born immigrant named William Knudsen was already proving him wrong. Formerly the president of General Motors, Knudsen had agreed to serve the Roosevelt administration for a symbolic salary of $1 per year. As the president's chief of production, he was beginning to orchestrate what would become the most dramatic industrial transformation the world had ever witnessed. Within 4 years, American factories would not merely achieve the supposedly impossible target of 50 aircraft annually that Göring had ridiculed. They would nearly double it, producing close to 100 planes each year, while simultaneously supplying 2 massive theaters of war separated by entire oceans. The contempt expressed in Berlin stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding of American industrial capacity. The declaration that triggered Göring's scorn had been delivered on May 16, 1940, as German armored divisions surged across France. Addressing Congress, Roosevelt stated plainly that he wanted the nation prepared to manufacture at least 50 aircraft per year. Even among America's allies, the announcement was met with doubt. In 1939, the United States had produced only 3 611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps possessed roughly 700 combat planes, many of them outdated and unsuitable for modern warfare. Roosevelt was calling for a 14-fold increase in output. The man tasked with turning this vision into reality was William Knudsen. When presidential advisor Bernard Baruch was asked who could possibly deliver such an extraordinary expansion, his response was blunt and unequivocal. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. Knudsen abandoned a $300 annual salary to serve his adopted country, bringing with him the principles of automotive mass production and applying them to the far more complex world of aircraft manufacturing. The transformation began immediately. By December 1941, the effects of America's industrial mobilization were already unmistakable. U.S. factories were producing roughly 2 military aircraft each month, representing a 20-fold increase compared to output just 2 years earlier. The nation's industrial giants moved rapidly. Ford Motor Company announced plans for an enormous bomber facility at Willow Run, Michigan. Boeing expanded its manufacturing capacity in Seattle. Douglas Aircraft hired tens of thousands of new workers. What Roosevelt had described as the arsenal of democracy was no longer a slogan, it was becoming a physical reality. The Nazi leadership's dismissal of American production capability was fueled by a toxic mixture of racial ideology and deliberate ignorance. General Friedrich von Boetticher, Germany's military attaché in Washington from 1933 to 1941, repeatedly sent detailed and accurate reports describing the scale and speed of American mobilization. In December 1940, he warned Berlin that U.S. war production would soon reach heights that defied imagination. His reports were routinely ignored or dismissed as defeatist exaggerations. When von Boetticher met Hitler in February 1939 to discuss America's long-term potential, the Führer responded not with strategic analysis but with ideological ranting. Hitler fixated on racial theories, declaring Americans to be half Judaized and half Negrofied, and therefore incapable of sustained military effort. He refused to consider empirical evidence of industrial capacity. This blindness would prove fatal. Such prejudice permeated every level of the Nazi command structure. Luftwaffe intelligence officers scoffed at reports that women were entering American aircraft factories, interpreting this development as proof of desperation rather than strength. They could not conceive that a democratic society might mobilize its population more effectively than a totalitarian state. When intelligence indicated that American factories were operating around the clock in 3 shifts, German analysts assumed the reports were exaggerated or fabricated. The Nazi worldview simply could not reconcile itself with American reality. Ford's Willow Run plant would soon become the clearest embodiment of this reality. Construction began on farmland in Michigan on April 18, 1941. The result was the largest factory ever built under a single roof, covering 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line stretching nearly 1 mile. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production chief, boldly promised that the plant would eventually produce 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, at a time when other factories struggled to complete 1 per day. The early results were disastrous. The first bomber, completed in September 1942, required extensive rebuilding. Quality control failures reached nearly 50%. By February 1943, Willow Run was producing only 56 bombers per month, far short of expectation. Critics mocked the facility, derisively asking not "Willow Run" but "Will it run?" Yet Ford's engineers persisted. Ford's engineering teams refused to accept defeat. They began by dismantling the complexity of the B-24 Liberator, which contained nearly 500,000 individual components, breaking the aircraft into smaller, standardized subassemblies that could be manufactured simultaneously. New hydraulic riveting tools were introduced. Wiring harnesses were prefabricated. The aircraft itself was reorganized around a moving assembly line rather than stationary construction. Despite the chaos of constant redesign, engineers managed to integrate 578 design changes in 1943, alone, without halting production. Gradually, output began to climb. By September 1943, Willow Run was producing 148 bombers per month. By December, that number had surged to 365. The decisive breakthrough arrived in April 1944, when the plant produced 428 B-24s in a single month, 1 bomber every 63 minutes, operating continuously, day and night. A single American factory was now producing more heavy bombers than the entire German aviation industry. German pilots were among the first to recognize what this imbalance meant. During the Tunisia campaign, Major Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdschwader 77th, observed in December 1942 that American pilots were no longer inexperienced amateurs. Even more troubling, he noted, their numbers seemed to increase daily. This realization accelerated throughout 1943. On January 27, 1943, American bombers carried out their first raid on Germany itself, with 64 aircraft attacking Wilhelmshaven. By October of that year, during the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, known as Black Thursday, the United States could lose 60 B-17s in a single day and replace them within 2 weeks. The arithmetic of war had shifted irreversibly. The scale of American air power became unmistakable during Big Week, from February 20 to 25, 1944, when the 8th and 15th Air Forces flew 3 500 bomber sorties against German aircraft production facilities. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, but the greater loss was the destruction of roughly 100 veteran pilots who could not be replaced. General Adolf Galland later reported to Göring that Germany was losing approximately 200 fighters per month while producing only 10. The United States, by contrast, was producing 500 fighters monthly, while losing fewer than 400. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's leading aces with 220 aerial victories, recalled a mission over Brunswick in January 1944. He described a bomber stream that stretched from horizon to horizon, at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. His unit had 8 fighters facing hundreds of bombers. Resistance, he said, felt utterly hopeless. By 1944, American aircraft production had reached astonishing levels. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,270 aircraft. This included 16 48 4-engine bombers, 35 743 fighters, and 22 591 multi-engine aircraft of various types. That single year's output exceeded Germany's entire wartime aircraft production, which totaled approximately 677 planes. The disparity extended far beyond raw numbers. Each American heavy bomber carried 1350 caliber machine guns with thousands of rounds of ammunition. German fighters increasingly took off with reduced ammunition loads due to shortages. American aircraft featured powered gun turrets, advanced bomb sights, and sophisticated navigation systems. German aircraft, by contrast, often lacked even functional radios. By May 1944, Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was producing 16 B-17 bombers every day. Douglas aircraft experienced equally explosive growth. From a workforce of just 68 employees in 1936, the company expanded to 167 workers across 9 facilities. North American Aviation was producing 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. Lockheed achieved a production rate of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, even while implementing 2 127 combat-driven design modifications. The supporting industrial base matched this pace. General Motors manufactured 57 658 aircraft engines under license. Packard produced 55 523 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Aluminum Company of America increased aluminum output by 600%. Dow Chemical expanded magnesium production from 6 million pounds annually to 333 million pounds. This industrial surge formed a self-reinforcing system of supply that Germany could not disrupt. The transformation of the American workforce shattered Nazi assumptions. In 1941, women made up less than 1% of aircraft industry workers. By 1943, they represented 65%, totaling approximately 310 women. At Douglas' Long Beach facility, more than 22 of its 41,600 employees were women. Roswell Monroe, the original Rosie the Riveter, drove 30 rivets per shift at Willow Run with 99.5% accuracy. Women inspectors at Douglas reduced defect rates from 32% to just 0.3%. Ford redesigned tools to accommodate smaller hands, unintentionally increasing efficiency. Lighter pneumatic equipment reduced fatigue, while improved workstation layouts lowered injury rates. German intelligence interpreted the employment of women as a sign of collapse. Captured Luftwaffe reports dismissed female labor as temporary and predicted inevitable quality failures. The opposite occurred. Precision improved. Women excelled in wiring, instrumentation, and inspection tasks. Their integration reflected democratic strength rather than desperation. As American output surged, Germany retreated into illusion. In February 1944, Hermann Göring authorized the Jaeger program, an attempt to preserve aircraft production by dispersing it into 729 underground facilities. These operations relied heavily on slave labor. The Mittelwerk complex alone employed approximately 60 prisoners under horrific conditions, with an estimated 20 dying from starvation, disease, or execution. These underground factories generated more defects than usable aircraft. Enslaved workers deliberately sabotaged components, and the logistical burden of transporting parts between dispersed sites caused constant delays. Quality control disintegrated. The entire middlework system produced fewer engines per month than Ford's single Chicago engine plant. While Germany retreated into concealment and coercion, American innovation accelerated openly. Boeing developed modular construction methods for the B-29 Superfortress across 4 geographically separated factories, producing completely interchangeable components. The pressurized B-29, which cost approximately $65 per aircraft, incorporated technologies Germany could not replicate even in prototype form. By early 1945, American factories were producing 100 B-29s per month. June 6, 1944, demonstrated the culmination of this industrial dominance. The Allied invasion of Normandy was supported by 11,500 A-90 aircraft. German forces managed only 319 sorties, resulting in a 36-to-1 air superiority. This was not merely a tactical advantage, it was industrial annihilation. Between January and May 1944, preparatory bombing campaigns dropped 145 tons of explosives on German targets, exceeding the total tonnage dropped by Germany on Britain throughout the entire war. Transport aircraft delivered 3 airborne divisions in a single day, using more planes than Germany had ever possessed in its entire transport fleet. By December 1944, single American raids routinely involved 1-200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. The P-51 Mustang symbolized the new reality. It possessed the range to reach targets deep into Poland, the performance to match any opponent, and the numbers to render losses irrelevant. German pilots referred to the Mustangs as Indians, appearing everywhere at once. As defeat loomed, even Nazi leadership began to acknowledge the catastrophe. By late 1944, the reality of Germany's production failure could no longer be concealed. In December of that year, Joseph Goebbels recorded in his diary that Göring's repeated promises of Luftwaffe superiority now appeared to be criminal delusions. Germany, he wrote, was attempting to fight the world's greatest industrial power with nothing but rhetoric. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reached the same conclusion before the Allied landings. He warned his staff that the Americans could afford to lose 10 tanks for every one Germany destroyed and still overwhelm the defenders. When the invasion came, he said, it would arrive with such overwhelming material superiority that no defensive position could possibly hold. Even Hitler himself admitted in January 1945 that Germany should have listened to von Boeticher's warnings. America's industrial capacity, he conceded, had been decisive. While Germany built hundreds, the United States built tens of thousands. Albert Speer later testified that American bombing campaigns reduced German tank production by 35%, aircraft production by 31%, and truck production by 42%. He stated unequivocally that the systematic American assault on industrial targets caused the collapse of German armaments production. Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, operational by mid-1944, represented a genuine technological leap, flying more than 100 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter. Hitler and Göring placed immense faith in this so-called wonder weapon, believing it could restore air superiority, despite overwhelming numerical inferiority. In reality, Germany produced only 430 Me-262s in total, with no more than 200 operational at any given time. The engines required overhaul after just 10 hours of flight. Critical materials were unavailable, forcing inferior substitutions that compromised performance. Meanwhile, the United States had begun jet development as early as 1942. Although the Bell P-59 proved underwhelming, Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, superior to any German jet, entered production before the war ended. America's industrial depth allowed it to pursue multiple advanced technologies simultaneously, a luxury Germany could not afford. Technological quality without quantity proved meaningless in total war. Der War sei. Hermann Göring's arrest on May 8, 1945, by elements of the U.S.B. 36th Infantry Division marked the beginning of his forced reckoning with reality. Initially held at an interrogation facility in Augsburg, Göring remained defiant, insisting that German technology had been superior and that defeat had resulted only from overwhelming enemy numbers. He continued to argue that qualitative excellence had been drowned by sheer mass. His transfer to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a special detention center for high-ranking Nazi officials, subjected him to sustained and systematic interrogation. In July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler conducted extensive interviews with Göring, carefully documenting the gradual erosion of his certainty. During these sessions, Göring began to acknowledge the scale of American industrial superiority. "I knew American industrial potential was great," Göring admitted, "but the execution exceeded my worst fears." He expressed particular shock at Willow Run, stating that the output of a single American factory surpassed the entire bomber strength Germany had ever achieved at its peak. He described this reality as incomprehensible. Göring was equally astonished by American logistics. He marveled at the United States' ability to supply massive forces across two oceans while maintaining uninterrupted domestic production. Germany, he noted bitterly, struggled to supply forces just 500 miles from its borders. The Americans supplied armies 5,000 miles from home. During the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors confronted Göring with overwhelming statistical evidence. Charts demonstrated that by 1944, the United States was producing more aircraft each month than Germany managed in an entire year. Films of Willow Run's assembly lines were screened in the courtroom, as prosecutors listed German cities devastated by bombers built in that single factory. In his testimony on March 14, 1946, Göring openly struggled to comprehend the numbers. He stated that while he had always believed America's economic and technical potential to be unusually strong, particularly in aviation, he never imagined aircraft production could increase 100-fold in 4 years. Such growth, he said, had seemed physically impossible. Prison psychologist Gustave Gilbert recorded Göring's growing obsession with production statistics. He repeatedly recalculated ratios, comparing individual American factories to the entire German aviation industry. He became fixated on Willow Run, referring to it as that damned factory that broke our backs. When presented with figures showing that the United States had produced 812, 615 aircraft engines compared to Germany's 241, 675, Göring stared silently at the data. The mathematics of defeat required no further explanation. By the end of the war, the full magnitude of America's production achievement stood beyond dispute. From a baseline of just 611 military aircraft in 1940, the United States produced a total of 295,959 aircraft before victory was secured. This included 97 810 bombers, 99 465 fighters, and 98 684 aircraft of other categories. These numbers reflected not merely quantitative dominance, but systemic superiority in every dimension of industrial organization. At peak output, nearly 2 million Americans were employed in aircraft production. The workforce was unprecedented in its diversity. Women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, disabled workers, teenagers, and elderly citizens all contributed. This democratic mobilization achieved what authoritarian command systems could not. Voluntary cooperation consistently outperformed coerced labor in efficiency, quality, and innovation. Workers who entered factories in 1941 with no prior aviation experience emerged in 1945 as the most skilled aviation workforce in the world. They did not merely build aircraft, they transformed manufacturing itself. Statistical quality control techniques, developed for bomber production, became global industrial standards. Automation principles refined at Willow reshaped modern mass production. The engineers who perfected bomber assembly lines would later design the Saturn V rocket. The women who riveted B-24s raised children who would walk on the moon. The production miracle did not end with victory. It laid the foundation for the American century. The financial scale of the effort defied conventional economic logic. Aircraft production consumed approximately $45 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to roughly $800 billion today. The B-29 program alone cost more than the Manhattan Project. Yet instead of bankrupting the nation, wartime production generated unparalleled prosperity. Chronic unemployment vanished. Personal income doubled between 1940 and 1945. War bond purchases by workers themselves financed much of the expansion. Employees at Willow Run alone bought $45 million in bonds, effectively funding the factory in which they worked. Germany, by contrast, devoted nearly 40% of its entire industrial capacity to aircraft production by 1944. Yet produced less than half of America's output. Increasing reliance on slave labor proved catastrophically counterproductive. Sabotage became routine. Quality deteriorated. Productivity per German worker declined after 1943, while American productivity increased by 300%. The infrastructure built for war became the backbone of post-war prosperity. Aluminum smelters constructed for bombers supplied materials for suburban housing. Chemical plants that produced aviation fuel evolved into the plastics industry. Machine tool factories that equipped aircraft plants retooled American industry for global leadership. Beyond sheer volume, the true strength of American production lay in organizational excellence. The War Production Board coordinated the efforts of 184 Zero companies, synchronizing supply chains that spanned the entire continent. IBM punch card systems tracked millions of components moving through thousands of suppliers, ensuring precision and speed at a scale never before attempted. At MIT, the radiation laboratory employed 4 Zero scientists to develop radar and navigation systems that gave American bombers reliable all-weather capability. When combat experience revealed vulnerabilities, solutions were implemented with astonishing speed. After frontline crews reported the B-17's susceptibility to frontal attacks, Boeing added chin turrets within 60 days. When Pacific operations demanded extended range, consolidated modified B-24s without halting production. German aircraft modifications required months or years. American changes took weeks. This adaptability proved as decisive as production volume. American aircraft evolved continuously in response to global combat feedback. Information flowed from battles in the Pacific to design teams in the United States within days. Engineers translated battlefield lessons into manufacturing changes almost immediately. Assembly line workers could communicate suggestions directly to designers. This democratic flow of information outperformed Germany's rigid hierarchical command structure. German aircraft, produced in isolated underground facilities by enslaved labor, remained largely static. American designs improved weekly. The feedback loop between combat experience and production achieved unprecedented efficiency. Pilots' observations reached engineers almost instantly. Engineers' solutions reached assembly lines just as fast. The system was self-correcting and relentlessly adaptive. On October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring wrote his final letter. In it, he offered his most complete admission of the production war's decisive role. The Americans, he wrote, had won through industrial power rather than military skill. Germany had not been defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. A nation dismissed as capable only of producing consumer goods had buried the Reich under steel and aluminum. His final recorded statement to Gustave Gilbert echoed the same conclusion. Germany, he said, had declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When that giant awakened, Germany's fate was sealed. The Americans did not merely outproduce Germany, they revolutionized production itself. Every element of their system proved superior. Göring took his own life that night, but his final testimony remained as history's judgment on the production war. Military historians widely agree that American industrial production was the decisive factor in the Allied victory. Without the overwhelming material superiority it provided, the Normandy landings would have been impossible, the strategic bombing campaign unsustainable, and the Pacific War unwinnable. Historian Richard Overy concluded that the war's outcome was determined not by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but by the sheer weight of material power. The Allies prevailed because they buried their enemies beneath an avalanche of production. The numbers confirm this judgment without ambiguity. By 1944, the United States alone was producing more military aircraft than the rest of the world combined, Axis and Allied alike. This was not marginal superiority, but dominance by orders of magnitude. Germany did not face simple defeat, it faced obliteration. Yet the significance of the production miracle extended far beyond military victory. It demonstrated the superiority of democracy over dictatorship, freedom over tyranny, and voluntary cooperation over forced obedience. The workers who achieved this transformation were not slaves or conscripts, but free citizens united by a shared purpose. Göring's contempt for American production capacity stands as one of history's most catastrophic miscalculations. His dismissal of democratic industrial potential cost Germany the war and millions of lives. Long before the first American bomber reached German airspace, the fate of the Third Reich had already been sealed. America in 1940 appeared unprepared for war. By 1944, it had become an unstoppable industrial colossus. Assembly lines proved as decisive as front lines. Factory workers became as essential as soldiers. Industrial mobilization shaped victory as surely as battlefield strategy. From Göring's mocking reaction to Roosevelt's announcement in May 1940 to his death in October 1946, his personal journey mirrored the destruction of Nazi Germany. His ideology confused belief with capability, tyranny with strength, and mythology with mathematics. The Reich Marshal, who ridiculed American aircraft production, died knowing that American factories had produced more planes in a single year than Germany had built throughout the entire war. His scorn became the epitaph of the Third Reich, a regime destroyed by its inability to understand reality. The United States produced 295,959 military aircraft. Germany produced 94,677. But the true victory lay not in numbers alone, but in method. Free workers outproduced slaves. Democratic coordination surpassed totalitarian command. A nation of immigrants and diverse citizens united to accomplish the impossible. The B-24 bombers rolling off Willow Run's assembly line every 63 minutes were more than machines of war. They were symbols of democratic power, each rivet driven by a woman who had been a housewife months earlier. Each engine built by a teenager who left school to serve. Each wing assembled by workers who had fled poverty and discrimination. Hermann Göring laughed at the idea of America producing 50,000 planes a year. America answered by producing twice that number, reshaping world history. His laughter echoes now as the sound of catastrophic miscalculation. The Fatal Underestimation of Democracy's Arsenal by a Man Who Understood Neither Democracy Nor Production.